election interference in 2016. Every U.S. intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did. My first question for you, sir, is who do you believe? My second question is, would you now, with the whole world watching, tell President Putin, would you denounce what happened in 2016, and would you warn him to never do it again?
So let me just say that we have two thoughts. You have groups that are wondering why the FBI never took the server. Why haven't they taken the server? Why was the FBI told to leave the office of the Democratic National Committee? I've been wondering that. I've been asking that for months and months, and I've been tweeting it out and calling it out on social media. Where is the server? I want to know, where is the server, and what is the server saying? With that being said, all I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be, but I really do want to see the server. But I have confidence in both parties. I really believe that this will probably go on for a while, but I don't think it can go on without finding out what happened to the server. What happened to the servers of the Pakistani gentlemen that worked on the DNC? Where are those servers? They're missing. Where are they? What happened to Hillary Clinton's emails? 33,000 emails gone, just gone. I think in Russia they wouldn't be gone so easily. I think it's a disgrace that we can't get Hillary Clinton's 33,000 emails. So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. And what he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer. Okay, thank you.
At the tail end of that incredible 2 minutes, President Trump echoed an offer from Vladimir Putin, made in private, to help with the Russia investigation. There is no documentation of what was actually said behind closed doors because, as the Washington Post reports, Donald Trump went to extraordinary lengths to conceal it. After one meeting with the Russian leader, Trump reportedly seized the notes of the American interpreter. We're going to speak with the person who broke that story, national security correspondent for the Washington Post, Greg Miller. That bombshell dropped just hours after the New York Times reported that the FBI had opened an inquiry into whether President Trump was secretly working on behalf of Russia. And we also have with us one of the reporters behind that piece, Michael Schmidt. On Saturday, the president was asked, point blank, have you ever worked for Russia? Nowhere in his 354-word answer did he say the word no. Welcome to Morning Joe on this Monday, January 14th. With us, we have columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius. We've got the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the book, A World in Disarray, Richard Haass. And White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Yamiche Alcindor.
Now, we're going to get to those two incredible reports in a moment, but first, let's give you the context, the political context of what both Republicans and Democrats are going to be working under this week. New polling showing that Americans are clearly blaming President Trump and clearly blaming the Republican Party, far more than Democrats, for the government shutdown stalemate that continues to drag on. According to the Washington Post ABC News poll, 53% say Trump and the Republican Party are at fault, compared to only 29% who blame the Democrats. Similarly, in a new CNN poll, 55% blame the president, only 32% say the Democrats are at fault. You break that down even further, polling shows that independents point the blame at the president and not the Democrats by a 53 to 23% margin. The 30% margin among independents. Every Republican on Capitol Hill knows. Every Republican Party leader across the nation knows. Those are devastating numbers. The Republicans lost in a landslide in the House of Representatives, their worst battering since Watergate. And now it continues just a few months later. Donald Trump continuing to lead them lower and lower and lower in the polls. Now, women are blaming the president, the Republicans, by a margin of 35%, while men are blaming the president and the Republicans by a margin of 13 points. When asked about the situation at the border, nearly half said there's a problem, but not a crisis. 26% said it wasn't a serious problem, but 24%, only 24%, less than 1 in 4 Americans said the situation was what Donald Trump said it was, a crisis. A majority of Americans oppose President Trump declaring a national emergency in order to build the wall. 66% to 31%. 2 in 1 oppose the president and the Republican Party shutting down the government to get extra money to build a wall. And CNN polling shows more than half of Americans oppose building any wall along the border with Mexico, while 39% favor the idea. But this is where it gets serious for the president, because this is a president who only cares about himself. Take a look at Donald Trump's approval rating. New CNN polling shows only 37% of Americans approve of his job performance. 57% disapprove. That is up 5 percentage points since December. And that increase comes largely from whites without a college degree, who, of course, have been a core group of supporters for the president. Currently, 45% approve, while 47% of whites without college degrees disapprove. The approval rating is down 9 points from last month, and this is the first time ever that Donald Trump has turned into negative territory with the group. And even the pollster that the president points to as his validator, Rasmussen Polling, finds that his ratings are falling. Trump's approval index dropped from -3 points a month ago to -13 points on Friday. At the beginning of January, he was at -7. Mika, devastating numbers all the way around. But again, this is something that we knew was coming. This is something that, bluntly, we warned Republicans they were going to shoulder the blame. This is something, when Donald Trump said in front of Nancy Pelosi and in front of Chuck Schumer, hey, I'm not going to blame you. This is all on me. This will be Trump's shutdown. The American people were listening, and there's nothing Donald Trump or any of the Republicans can do now trying to twist the facts to change any of that.
Well, you could see on Chuck Schumer's face in that meeting as he was sort of looking down and trying not to laugh, like, are you this stupid? Because when he said he would own that shutdown and put it in his own words on tape for everyone to see, he doesn't understand exactly how bad that shutdown is going to reflect on him. Those numbers are about the shutdown. Those numbers are about the wall. Yeah. Those numbers are about what's happening in Washington, but what's also happening and what you could hear in the president's voice on Saturday night appears to be panic.
By the way, can we just say
you can.
You don't have to be a pop psychiatrist to listen to Donald Trump's voice on Fox News this weekend, and he was in a full-on panic.
Yeah.
Full-on panic, talking 100 miles an hour. You know, that in that clip with Lemire, he just looks like he got caught. He got busted, and he was in front of Vladimir Putin, so he had to trash his own U.S. intel agencies. But boy, the other night, he was in
didn't have control.
Panic mode.
So President Trump and his allies reacted this weekend to the New York Times report that the FBI began investigating whether Trump had been working against American interests on behalf of Russia after the spring of 2017 firing of Director James Comey. According to former law enforcement officials and others familiar with the probe, counterintelligence investigators had to consider whether the president's actions constituted a possible threat to national security, unprecedented on so many levels. Agents and senior FBI officials had grown suspicious of Mr. Trump's ties to Russia during the 2016 campaign, but held off on opening an investigation into him, in part because they were uncertain how to proceed with an inquiry of such sensitivity and magnitude. Agents also sought to determine whether Mr. Trump was knowingly working for Russia or had unwittingly fallen under Moscow's influence. No evidence has emerged publicly that Mr. Trump was secretly in contact or took direction from Russian government officials. The president responded to the story in parts of the 12 tweets that he sent on Saturday morning, 12 tweets saying the investigation was opened with no reason and no proof. He later gave an interview to Fox News.
Are you now, or have you ever worked for Russia, Mr. President?
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written. And if you read the article, you'd see that they found absolutely nothing. But the headline of that article, it's called The Failing New York Times for a reason. They've gotten me wrong for 3 years. They've actually gotten me wrong for many years before that.
I think Donald Trump also called the New York Times after his election the crown jewel of American journalism or something like that. But again, we'll just put that to the side and bring in Michael Schmidt right now. Michael, why now? Talk about developing this story, and why is it that here we are at the beginning of 2019 that you finally had enough to go with the story?
Well, in many ways, it's something that we've been trying to understand for a year and a half since the investigation was launched in May of 2017 to sort of understand the contours of it. We were helped along the way by testimony that had been provided to Congress by the FBI's general counsel, its top lawyer at the time, who talked about how the firing of Comey so unnerved the FBI. They did not understand what was going on. They knew there was this larger Russia investigation. They knew that there was a possibility that the president was trying to interfere with it. And if he was trying to interfere with the Russia investigation, what was motivating that? What was driving that? Was that his connections to Russia? There had been these questions about what he said about Russia on the campaign trail. The FBI knew about his trip for the Miss Universe pageant to Russia. They knew about the Steele dossier, and they took that historic, momentous decision in May of 2017 to open the investigation, which was then taken over just days later by Bob Mueller when he was appointed special counsel.
So, Michael, Tom Nichols wrote for the USA Today that it actually would have been surprising, given all of the strange behavior exhibited by the president during his campaign on this show, actually, in December of 2015, moving forward. And through the first couple of years of his presidency, he actually said that it would have been strange had the FBI not made an inquiry into whether there was any connection between Russia and Donald Trump that might impact America's national security. Can you tell me what sort of division there was inside the Bureau on whether this should be launched or not?
Well, the Bureau is sort of looking at two questions. They're looking at a question of obstruction, simple criminal obstruction. Was the president breaking the law by trying to interfere with the investigation? And then the counterintelligence question, the national security question, something that would not usually result in a criminal charge, but trying to answer what are his ties and why is he acting that way. It is true, he did do a lot of things before May of 2017 that made investigators very suspicious. The problem is that to open up an investigation on the president, you have to clear a particularly high bar. As we've seen, it creates a lot of problems for the president when you do that. So you better have enough evidence and feel good about what you're doing before you go forward with that. It was the firing of Comey that led them to that point, that made them feel comfortable to open an investigation into him.
Right. But Michael, the question is, was there significant dissent within the FBI to open the investigation, or did most of the people that had that decision basically in their hands, did most of them agree that this is something that they needed to look into?
I think that this is something that they thought for much of the spring of 2017 they needed to look into. I think they were in agreement after the Comey firing that they had to go ahead and do that. I do not know what the reaction was by senior Justice Department officials like Rod Rosenstein at the time that it was opened. The FBI had gone ahead and done this on their own. You also, I think we sometimes forget what was going on in the larger context of the Justice Department at the time. Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, the person who was overseeing the Russia investigation, had just provided the president with a rationale for firing Comey that was not the president's real reason for getting rid of him. And the FBI looked at that very skeptically as well. So they see all of these things going on, and it is in that environment that they made the decision to investigate the president.
David Ignatius, want to back up a bit and get some perspective here. Is there any precedent for President Trump's attempt to keep the content of his conversations with Putin away from people in our own government?
I have never seen any instance like this. It's typical that you have multiple aides who are supporting the president. Certainly you have a translator whose notes are discussed, disseminated. When this news broke over the weekend that there'd been suppression of notes from one of President Trump's meetings with Putin, I happened to be with a former White House chief of staff. He was dumbfounded. He said, I can't believe that. It's not possible that they'd seek to suppress the notes. This person said that in his time in government, he'd never seen anything remotely close to this. So the question obviously is, why? What was so secret about these meetings? What was so personal and private? In the footage that we watched at the opening of this segment, where we saw Donald Trump confronted with a sharp question about his relationship with Putin, we saw him sort of sputter. There's a term that investigators use, deflection. When you're asked a stressful question you don't want to answer, you deflect. Mm-hmm. And we saw a perfect instance of that. But just to say finally, Michael Schmidt's reporting on this FBI investigation is so important because it reminds us that the FBI's job in the beginning of this was about Russia. This was a counterintelligence investigation into anomalous, strange behavior involving the president. And the question that the reporting raises is whether the alleged obstruction of justice and firing Comey and other actions, whether that was the collusion, that was the effort to help Russia.
Well, and David, that is something that many legal experts have been bringing up over the past several days, that perhaps the obstruction was the collusion. Maybe it was part of the collusion. Maybe we don't have two separate legal theories moving at the same time. Maybe it comes together. That said, just let's step back just for 1 second. And David, tell me, what were your thoughts the first time you saw the headline, Michael Schmidt's headline in the Times headline, that the President of the United States, any President of the United States, was being investigated as an asset of one of our foreign enemies?
Joe, I am not somebody who goes for conspiracy theories. I think usually the simpler explanation is correct. So I've been reluctant to see this as a story of an American candidate and then president who was the tool of a foreign intelligence service. You begin to have to look at that more seriously now as you put everything together. I mean, in a sense, this is a conspiracy hiding in plain sight. You just put together every known fact, every piece of video with Trump and Putin together. It's our friend Ben Wittes from Lawfare who made this argument that you and I were talking about, that it's the obstruction that is the collusion. Suddenly that seems so clear. We're going to have a wild month ahead. It's likely that Mueller will issue his report over the next month, and all these issues that are pregnant are going to come roaring at us. You can see the president's already destabilized as he thinks about how he's going to have to deal with them.
Yeah, let's bring in Greg Miller. Greg, of course, you're reporting at the Washington Post. Brought to the American people the fact that this president, who had already made a lot of Americans and a lot of foreign policy leaders uncomfortable with wanting to meet alone with Vladimir Putin, except with an interpreter, after the meeting, seized the interpreter's notes. So even those closest to him in the White House would not know the content of the conversation between Vladimir Putin and himself. Tell us about your reporting. Tell us about the story. Tell us about the possible implications.
I mean, as you just alluded to there, this is a president who doesn't really listen to his aides going into these meetings. And then this story is about how he often conceals what transpires in these meetings from those same aides afterward. And, you know, that would be disconcerting in any circumstance for a president meeting with any world leader. But of course, the context here is Russia and the Russia investigation and the enormous cloud, which is a term the president himself uses, the cloud that hangs over him, the suspicion that hangs over him because of these questions about his relationship with Vladimir Putin and his motivation for so much of what he says and does.
Do you have any information about what happened to the notes? Anybody in the administration? Do they know if he destroyed the notes? Do they know if he stored them somewhere? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what became of the notes. You know, the other officials in the administration only learned that Trump had taken the notes later when they tried to go to this interpreter just to ask questions about what had happened. They were looking for a readout of what had happened in that meeting. And the interpreter is the one who says, look, I was told not to talk about it. The president took my notes. And I mean, this was just sort of astonishing to these other officials. These are officials in the Trump administration. This included his top Russia advisor in the White House, who's on this trip, but is nevertheless excluded from these meetings with Vladimir Putin.
So this interpreter, is it possible that this interpreter may possibly be brought to Capitol Hill and questioned by the Oversight Committee?
Well, I think that there certainly is that impulse right now. And of course, in our story, we quote the incoming chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee saying that he plans to establish an investigative subcommittee to look exactly at this question of Trump's meetings with Putin and what has happened on those occasions. But of course, it's also a sensitive thing because interpreters, they're not the president's advisors or aides. They're there for a very narrow, impartial function. And so there's also some concern about dragging an interpreter before Congress to reveal the communications of a president.
Let's bring in Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard, it seems a bit ridiculous to even ask because we know the answer is no, but we need to check it off of your list as well. Have you ever heard of a president having a one-on-one meeting without any aides and only having an interpreter with him and then having that interpreter deliver back to him the notes with the order to not talk about anything that was mentioned in the meeting?
Not surprisingly, Joe, the answer is no. In my experience, and I've worked in 4 administrations, you have both an interpreter when you need one, and you have an official, usually the National Security Council aide, who takes notes. And there's an important difference between an interpreter's notes and the official's notes. When I look at an interpreter's notebook, they often just write the odd word. They're trying to remember things because they're doing usually consecutive translation, sometimes simultaneous. So it's to basically keep up with the conversation. When you have a National Security Council aide sitting there, he or she essentially reconstructs the entire conversation. They know the policy. They know the subtlety of what's behind this or that statement, what it might, the context of it. So the fact, first of all, that the meeting took place without National Security Council aid in and of itself is unprecedented. And
that's
then again,
bizarre.
the fact that the notes were destroyed.
By itself.
Pardon?
That's crazy.
I said that's bizarre by itself that you would meet with Vladimir Putin without a foreign policy expert from your administration. That in and of itself should raise so many red flags. You're exactly right. But then to destroy notes or to get notes from an interpreter afterwards, my gosh, talk about a guilty mental state. That certainly has to raise so many flags inside the Mueller investigation.
Exactly. Look, Joe, you need the notes, by the way, in order to do all sorts of follow-up and things like that. The bureaucracy needs to respond to a meeting because right now you have the meeting is kind of floating out there and the U.S. government doesn't know what happened, so it can't follow up. It can't correct on it. And this just feeds this larger story. Let's just put it out there. From day one of this administration, no one has been able to explain, we're in the land of David Ignatius novels, exactly what is motivating this president on Russia, because there's no strategic rationale for it. I can't defend what the administration and what the president is doing is on foreign policy grounds, so therefore it shifts us onto all the sorts of things that are beginning to come out.
Well, a man who's had contacts with Russia for years, and somebody who came on our show in December of 2015, Mika, defending Vladimir Putin, saying he was a strong leader. And when we brought up that he assassinated journalists, he assassinated political opponents, Donald Trump's only response was, well, you know, our soldiers have killed a lot of people in Iraq, too.
Yeah, no, I mean, all the indications are that something is being hidden. So, Michael Schmidt, just to conflate your reporting with Greg's even more, wouldn't the FBI want to talk to the interpreter?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What would Mueller think? What does Mueller see when he looks at this? Is this something that he has already looked at, or is this something that would slow him down here at the end and force him to go back and say, well, this sort of cuts at at sort of these questions that we're looking at? We do not know exactly what Mueller did with the counterintelligence part of this investigation when he took it over in May of 2017. But what we do know is that Mueller had a series of questions for the president that he relayed to the president's lawyers early last year, and that a certain subset of them related to Russia. And we do know that in November, when the president finally responded to Mueller, he sent back responses to the Russia questions. We had long thought of this as an obstruction investigation focused on the firing of Comey, but at the end of the day, the president has answered a lot of Russia questions to Mueller, questions that he still had as recently as November.
And David Ignatius, this weekend, the Trump White House obviously was spinning frantically with all the bad news coming out about Donald Trump and Russia and the destroying of the notes, or at least the hiding of the translator's notes. And what we kept hearing was, oh, this president's been tougher on Russia than Barack Obama. And they would talk about sanctions. Sanctions, by the way, that the United States Congress, the Republican Congress, said that they were going to pass regardless. And they weren't going to allow the president to ease sanctions with Russia. But also, you now, of course, have Donald Trump trying to end sanctions on an oligarch that's extremely close to Vladimir Putin. That is yet another big lie, is it not, that Donald Trump is somehow being tougher on Russia than Barack Obama was?
Well, Obama doesn't win super high marks for toughness on Russia, I have to be honest. And Trump is right to argue that he's tried to increase defense spending in some key areas. But if you look at his actual behavior toward Russia, what you see is a degree of deference. Take Syria. Donald Trump is so eager to get out of Syria that when you say the consequence of our rapid withdrawal of our 2,000 special forces will be to enhance Russian, Iranian, and Syrian regime power in Syria, Trump doesn't care. It doesn't really register with him that this is empowering Vladimir Putin. If you look in the Gulf, if you look at Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the country that's really doing the action now, that's trying to be the deal maker, the place setter, is Russia. It's not the United States. Mike Pompeo is having a kind of odd, bumpy trip through the region. Less talk of deals down the road, I gather, than the Russians have been getting in similar trips. So the Trump argument, I'm tough on Russia, what do you mean, doesn't really hold up when you look at it carefully.
No, Mika, especially, as David said, he's handing Syria to Vladimir Putin. There are few things that Putin would want more.
All right, the New York Times' Michael Schmidt, the Washington Post, Greg Miller, thank you both for your incredible reporting. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we've got several big stories to get to. New reporting says the Trump administration requested options for a military strike against Iran. We're going to tell you about John Bolton's role in that, plus a preview of tomorrow's confirmation hearing for President Trump's pick for Attorney General, what Democrats are demanding from William Barr. And The Atlantic magazine is out this morning with its list of the 50 moments that define an improbable presidency. We're going to bring in their editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg. But first, let's go to Bill Cairns with a check on the winter storm hitting a lot of the country. Bill?
Yeah, today's still shut down in Washington, D.C. in many ways, I guess we should say. But they're going to big cleanup and the big dig will be going on today. We saw 10 inches of snow, and it was an epic snowball fight at the Washington Monument yesterday. I mean, there were hundreds of people that were out there enjoying themselves, and it was a lot of fun in the sun, in the snow on a nice weekend. It wasn't too cold either. So now that snowstorm is finished with, we'll slowly do a little cleanup in D.C. today. It'll be about 37 degrees. New York City about 35. It's a cold morning in these areas, so a few spots are still going to be a little bit icy. Now we're going to fast forward to the next storm, because this one looks like a big one. California is going to get slammed. You're going to hear a lot about mudslides and debris flows and flooding issues on Wednesday into Thursday in California. We take that snow in the blue here on Friday into the Central Plains, and this one looks like another coast-to-coast storm. By the time we get to Saturday, we take the snow throughout the Ohio Valley, southern Great Lakes, and then the Northeast Saturday night, and then Sunday looks like a snowstorm in areas of interior sections of New England. A little early to tell yet what we're going to do on I-95, the big cities, most likely going from snow over to a wintry mess. So stay tuned if you have any travel plans the end of this week and into the weekend in the areas of the East. A lot of issues at the airports. We leave you with New York City and Times Square. Mostly avoided the snowflakes this weekend. That may not be the case, though, come Sunday. We'll give you updates throughout the week. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Huge share of government workers were going to take vacation days, say between Christmas and New Year's. And then we have a shutdown, and so they can't go to work, and so then they have the vacation, but they don't have to use their vacation days. And then they come back, and then they get their back pay, then they're, in some sense, they're better off.
White House Chief Economic Advisor Kevin Hassett comparing the government shutdown's impact on nearly 800,000 federal workers to a free vacation. Yeah, except they have zero money and zero that they're getting on their paychecks with no end in sight. Yamish, I don't really know how to put into words the heartlessness of this administration as they try to characterize this shutdown. What are your thoughts moving forward? And for all of these workers, how do they know what tomorrow holds in terms of their pay?
Well, the answer is simple. They simply do not know. People are incredibly anxious. They're incredibly stressed. Just to run through some of the things that we've been hearing at PBS NewsHour, there's a woman who is postponing her surgery because she can't afford to have it without knowing if she's going to be able to have the money to take care of herself. There are people who are putting off being able to buy a house. There are people who are putting off being able to move into a Section 8 apartment because the Department of Housing and Urban Development isn't doing what they need to do. There are people who are on food stamps and are still worried whether or not those food stamps are going to go. The federal government is saying that they're going to fund those food stamps, but I was talking to people in Miami who are still very anxious about whether or not they can do this. So over and over again across the country, we see people who are trying to make do and trying to figure out how to really live their lives as this government shutdown stretches on. And I want to add federal private contractors. These are people who aren't federal workers, but who are contractors. They work all across the DMV. There are thousands of them out there. They're not going to get back pay. So for a lot of families that work with the federal government, this is not a paid vacation. This is going to be this is not a vacation at all. No one that I've talked to has at all characterized this as a vacation.
So a lot of people have been asking me, and this is the question, because obviously the president has been brought bipartisan solutions to this, even at times when both sides agree he won't. Should Democrats and Republicans do something to get around him? Can they, and then add on a sub-question to that, can they do anything about the workers who don't get back pay?
As of right now, the Congress can't do anything. Well, they could do something for the workers who don't get back pay, but the bill that was passed was focused on federal workers, and historically, that's who's gotten back pay. They have not historically given back pay to federal contractors because they're seen as almost like a different part of the agenda or a different part of the workforce that Congress usually doesn't deal with. In terms of what Congress should do, there are people that obviously want to, including Republicans in the president's own party, who want to be able to pass a bill, maybe be able to overcome a veto by President Trump and get the government open. But that's going to be very, very hard. So what it's really a political conundrum. The president, I think, feels backed into a corner because he was about to take a deal where he was going to get some funding for the wall, and he was going to be able to also say, hey, we didn't get all the money that we wanted to get, but at least this is a start. And conservative media pushed back on that. Rush Limbaugh, Laura Ingraham, all these people basically told the president, you lost here, and he froze and said, you know what, I don't want that deal. So now we don't see Mitch McConnell in these negotiations. We see Kevin McCarthy, we see Vice President Pence, but the Senate already passed the bill that the president indicated he was going to sign it. And when he didn't sign it, Congress said, okay, well, we can't really deal with you. You're going to have to come up with your own deal, and we'll pass it once you can get it through. And right now, everybody looks backed into a corner.
It is a talk radio shutdown, Mika, and what we are seeing is Donald Trump's approval ratings plummet. We're seeing the percentage of Americans who actually support talk radio solutions. It ain't in the 40s, that's for sure. Donald Trump listened to a couple of voices mocking him, ridiculing him, and his numbers have plummeted, even in the Rasmussen poll, which is by far the friendliest poll that he has. And, Mika, it's only going to get worse because now we're starting to get reports of TSA agents not being able to show up at work because they're not getting paid, and some are having to look for other jobs so they can put food on their families' tables.
This is crazy.
And airports, some airports were reporting TSA lines shut down yesterday. I fear that's only going to get worse in the coming days and weeks.
All right, still ahead, President Trump goes after his former fixer Michael Cohen and gets a warning from top Democrats about the trouble he could face if the attacks continue.
He's trying to intimidate a witness.
It's incredible. We'll have this for you. Plus, the Atlantic magazine's look at the 50 moments that have defined the Trump presidency thus far. Jeffrey Goldberg joins us.
Goldberg, a consummate showman, right? What does he put his number 50 to draw people in? He's like a carnival barker, right?
What's that?
Come into the tent here. Donald Trump puts his hands on the orb. That's number 50. See?
Okay.
See? You want to know what the other 49 are now because Goldberg is such a showman.
Okay,
That's
Goldberg
next.
joins us next on Morning Joe.
Morning Joe.
Joining us now, political writer for the New York Times and MSNBC political analyst Nick Confessori and editor-in-chief of the Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg. This morning, the Atlantic is out with its report on the 50 moments that have defined the Trump presidency so far.
And Jeffrey, we're going to get to the list in a moment. But again, number 50.
All right.
Donald Trump touches the magic orb. How am I not drawn in immediately?
Come on.
You want to read the entire list.
You are our target. You are our target audience. I know
exactly.
I know the orb fascinates you.
It certainly does. It certainly does. All right, so let's talk about, though, before we do that, something far more fascinating and frightening. First of all, the news from the Washington Post that Donald Trump not only against the advice of all of his advisors and most foreign policy experts, he not only met privately with Vladimir Putin, but he also made sure to seize the notes from the interpreter afterwards. What's the impact of that?
You know, the mind doesn't want to go where it's going on that story. It's kind of too absurd to believe. The impact of the story could be huge. I mean, there could be, as David Ignatius mentioned to you a little earlier, there could be a non-conspiratorial reason that this is happening. Donald Trump does upend all sorts of norms in his behavior and the way he approaches foreign leaders. So maybe there is a quote-unquote innocent explanation for this. It just seems as if, I mean, the easy explanation is he was embarrassed by something he said, or he knew that something he said was compromising in some way and wanted to make sure that the translator who works for the United States government didn't share it with any of his officials.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, that coincidence, if it were just a coincidence or if there were an innocent explanation, that followed Donald Trump saying, I trust the ex-KGB agent more than I trust my intel community. Follows one bizarre incident after another, going all the way back to when we interviewed him in 2015, and he said on our show that Vladimir Putin was a strong leader and basically preferred him to Barack Obama, and it was fine that he murdered people. We kill people too.
Look, our Frank Four in this project we did on the Trump the first 2 years, talks about collusion that's in plain sight. I mean, you don't have to be. This is not a mystery in some ways. There's a pattern of behavior. Our jobs in journalism, our job is just to establish the patterns. And there's a fact set here that is very compromising, and pointing it out is the most obvious thing to do in the world. Doesn't make. Go on. Sorry.
I was just going to ask you the same question I asked David Ignatius. What was your reaction? What was your gut reaction when you first saw Michael Schmidt's story that said the FBI was investigating the President of the United States to see if our president was an agent of a foreign power who considers themselves to be enemies with the United States of America?
I mean, there's two reactions. One is the practical reaction, which is, of course. I mean, like I said, there's a set of facts that lead you to think that that's their duty to do. The other reaction is that is incredible. I mean, that in the true definition of incredible, it's beyond credibility. How has it come to pass that we're having a serious debate about whether the President of the United States is possibly a Russian intelligence asset? And we're having a serious conversation about it. That's something that... I mean, I always go back to the Obama tan suit controversy. Remember what a controversy used to look like in Washington. Now we're talking about Manchurian Candidate style scandals. It's just mind-boggling.
Well, and Richard Haas, let's talk about what's going on across the globe right now. You've had Mike Pompeo have a rough tour across the world, and now he's talking with Saudi Arabia. This is a region that's really up for grabs right now. What has been the impact of Donald Trump, and what has the impact of our scattered foreign policy meant as Mike Pompeo has gone across the region, doing, I would suggest, making some very unfortunate statements.
Yeah, the Secretary of State did himself and this country no favor with the speech he gave, which was wildly inappropriate on anywhere, but certainly on foreign soil. But I think the larger story in the Middle East is one of American pullback, most dramatically in Syria. But when the president goes to Iraq, he neglects to meet with the Iraqi government leadership. And all of this adds up to a sense that we're trying to wash our hands of this region. We're leaving it to Iran, despite all of our tough talk, to Russia. We've given up on any political change in Syria. So we're getting a laboratory. We're getting a glimpse, Joe, of what the world looks like when the United States abdicates. And as we're seeing in the Middle East, it's anything but pretty. It's not just that bad people and bad actors come to the fore, but people stop thinking about what this might mean for American interests. We are essentially limiting our influence in a part of the world that still matters, whether it's energy or the potential for terrorists or nuclear proliferation. I'll just say one other thing. A few weeks ago, we were talking about the new year, and I said that the thing that worried me most was the possibility of a war involving Iran. Well, in the last 48 hours, we see the National Security Advisor talking about asking for war plans for potential strikes against Iran. You've got an Israeli government that's attacking Iranian position in Syria in the run-up to the Israeli elections. You've got a Saudi leadership that would love to have the story be the problem that Iran is posing, so people stop talking about Mr. Khashoggi's murder. So this is beginning to line up, I think, as the most dangerous part of the world for 2019.
David Ignatius, you have a president who talks about wanting to bring an end to what he calls endless wars, taking a couple thousand highly effective troops out of Syria, and at the same time his national security advisor is making plans to attack Iran.
The Syria back and forth has just been appalling. It's just like watching a bouncing ball from one day to the next. You almost feel sorry for National Security Advisor John Bolton, who lays out a tough rollback of Trump's initial announcement about withdrawal of troops, and then the contradictions and corrections and second guesses of his statements begin. And at this point, I think it's very difficult for anyone in the region to know precisely what our Syria policy is. I wanted to ask Jeffrey Goldberg, who's done this wonderful exercise looking at the top 50 moments of Trump world in the last 2 years. Jeffrey, I often wonder what lasting damage this period is going to do to American politics and our standing in the world. What's your intuition about that?
Well, nothing lasts forever. I mean, we do wax and wane in our influence and in our popularity. But I do, and look, you're on the exact right question. It's when Trump is no longer president, do we bounce back to our usual selves, or is this some sign of inevitable decline? I think obviously the longer this goes and the weirder it gets, and you know what, it's this bipolar quality or multipolar quality to policymaking right now. No one can trust us anymore because the president makes foreign policy by tweet after seeing something on television. The national security apparatus agencies are trying to analyze our moves and can't understand them because we can't understand them. So as a long-term, long-term, we just look unserious because we elected someone who does not approach the world in any kind of serious, coherent fashion with a mind toward what American values are globally.
I would take it a step further and worry that we look weak and that this is the moment that anybody with ill will has to act or to get further than they have been able to get in the past as it pertains to us on the international stage. Yamiche.
Right. The president has been described as politically Teflon. When you look at these moments, are there any of these moments that threaten his presidency more than another?
That's an interesting question. I would say anything having to do with the collusion investigations, I do think threaten his presidency. I mean, I think like most people in Washington, we just assume until proven otherwise that this presidency lasts 4 years. But on the Russia front, and we have a piece by Annie Lowry ranked very high on our list about, because we forget all these things, his business dealings. The man is still in business. The man still hasn't released his tax returns. Let's say somebody does find his tax returns. We might find some really interesting things in there. There are things that do, I think, threaten the presidency. There are things like the magic orb, which just go to the cosmic weirdness of this whole presidency. But I think he's in jeopardy on multiple fronts.
So, Jeff, I hope you'll come back in 2 years and give us the next list for the second 2 years, and hopefully it will be a bit different. But I do want to ask you, so what's number one? Obviously, there are some things on this list that make you giggle a little bit. There are some things that make you frown. There are some things that are tremendously sad and significant. So what's number one?
Number one has to do with the family and child separation policy. And we put it there because it seemed to go against nature a bit, and certainly goes against traditional Republican thinking about the sanctity of families, which is also Democratic thinking. It's American thinking. It just seems so. It was the gratuitousness of it, the cruelty of it, that struck us as having lasting moral consequence.
Richard Haas, wrap up the first hour for us.
We're in a place
Good luck.
Domestically that, quite honestly, none of us ever thought we would get to. The conversations we've had around this table and other people are having when they read the New York Times and Washington Post, we've now gone to a place, quite honestly, not only have we never seen, Joe, but none of us ever thought we would see. And here we are, we're only halfway through this presidential turn, yet the foreign policy conversation shows the world goes on while this is going on. That you can't press the pause button. So the United States is distracted, it's divided, we're inconsistent on steroids, things are happening, things are deteriorating, and yet we still have in front of us constitutional and political issues of the like that we've never contended with before. If you're not worried, you're not paying attention.
And Yamiche, you've obviously for the past 3 years been reporting, going across the country and reporting on people supporting Donald Trump. I'm curious, as you see these numbers starting to bleed, Donald Trump starting to bleed support among working class white voters without college degrees. Are you surprised by that, or do you think that this is just the natural consequence of a government shutdown and some trade policies that are really having a tough impact on farmers and working class Americans?
I'm not surprised by that, but it is in some ways striking to people because this is a president who's really kept his base through scandal after scandal. The Atlantic is talking about 50 moments. We could probably maybe do 360 moments, right? There's so many things that are going on with porn stars, with Russia, with all sorts of things going on. But when you hit people in their pockets, and that's what the shutdown is doing, it's hitting people in their pockets, people start to reevaluate whether or not they can support a presidency. That means that you might not be able to pay your mortgage or might not be able to get your insulin. So I think when you start threatening people's lives, that's when President Trump really gets into a place where people are wondering whether or not they can continue to support him.
Yamiche Alcindor, thank you very much. Richard Haas, thank you. Jeffrey, stay with us. Still ahead, we have much more on the two bombshell reports that are raising new questions about Donald Trump's ties to Russia. Tom Nichols say all the signs point the same way, that Vladimir Putin has compromising information on our president. Tom will be our guest. Plus, the Washington Post's Philip Rucker joins us with his new reporting about the president's inability to be a reliable negotiator in the shutdown showdown. It is reporting that the president didn't lie too much in his Saturday tweet storm. Morning Joe is coming right back.